My son told the room I was his charity case. He said it smooth and easy, the way men say things they've practiced in front of mirrors, right in the middle of his company's annual investor showcase, in front of 11 suits and 2 junior partners. He called me a family situation he'd stepped up to handle. He said it while I was standing 20 feet away in the lobby of his office building, holding a tray of sparkling water glasses that his event coordinator had thrust into my hands the moment I walked through the door, assuming I was part of the catering crew. My name is Irwin. I am 67 years old. I spent 33 years as a licensed master electrician in Central Ohio, built my own contracting company from a single truck and a rented storage bay, and retired with enough financial stability that I have never once had to ask my son for a single thing. The office building my son was hosting his gala in that night, the one with his company logo glowing blue on the glass facade, the one the investors were admiring, the one he was calling our anchor asset in his pitch deck, belonged to me. Not to him, not to the business, to me. Specifically to a company I had registered 12 years ago called Copper Ridge Holdings LLC, of which I am the sole member. My son had been paying rent to Copper Ridge Holdings every month for 4 years. He knew the name. He had signed the lease. What he did not know, what nobody in that building knew, was that the man they were treating as a piece of the furniture was the man who owned the furniture, the floors, and every 4 walls around them. But I am getting ahead of myself. This story did not start with the gala. It started, the way these things always do, with love. I gave my son every advantage I never had. My wife, Lorene, God rest her, we raised him in a good house on a quiet street outside Columbus. She was a school nurse. I was out before 5 every morning and back after dark most nights. We were not wealthy by any stretch, but we were solid. By the time our son was in high school, the business had grown enough that I was managing a crew of 16 and bidding on commercial contracts. We paid for his college. We bought him a used car when he turned 18. We showed him what it looked like to build something real with your hands and your word. What we did not manage to show him, somewhere along the way, was how to be humble about it. He married Kayla 7 years ago. She is a sharp woman, I will give her that. Sharp edges, sharp tongue, sharp eyes, for anything that might make her look bad at a dinner party. From the first Thanksgiving she spent at our table, I watched her quietly inventory everything in the room and file it under acceptable or not acceptable. My old farmhouse table, not acceptable. My collection of antique electrical insulators I had been picking up at flea markets for 20 years, definitely not acceptable. The way I said fixin' to when I meant I was about to do something, absolutely not acceptable. Lorene passed 3.5 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 61 days from diagnosis to the end. I will not describe those days in detail because some things do not need an audience. What I will say is that when she was gone, the house in Columbus felt like a room with all the air sucked out. My son called me 2 weeks after the funeral and suggested I consider moving closer to them. He and Kayla had a spare room in their house in Nashville. He said they wanted to keep an eye on me. He said it was the right thing to do. I should have heard the phrasing more carefully. Keep an eye on me. Not spend time with you. Not we would love to have you. Keep an eye on me. Like I was a pot left on the stove. I sold the Columbus house, put most of the proceeds into my investment accounts, and drove south. Within 3 weeks of arriving, I understood my actual role in their household. It was not father, and it was not guest. It was something closer to live-in maintenance staff. The dishwasher made a grinding noise. Irwin will fix it. The back fence had a rotting post. Irwin will handle it. Kayla wanted the guest bathroom retiled. Well, Irwin knows how to do tile work, doesn't he? And I did. So I did. I did not complain because I genuinely do not mind working with my hands. It is in my blood. But there is a profound difference between a man choosing to help his family and a man being assigned to the labor pool without being asked. The first time I understood what I had walked into was a Tuesday morning. My son and Kayla were hosting a couple from their social circle. I had never met them before. I was in the kitchen making coffee when they arrived. Kayla walked the couple through the house with the practiced tour guide energy she reserved for impressing people, and when they reached the kitchen doorway, she paused, gestured loosely in my direction, and said, "And this is Irwin. He helps out around the house." She did not say my father-in-law. She did not say Jared's dad. She said Irwin. He helps out. I held my coffee mug and nodded and said nothing, but I noted it. Over the months that followed, I kept a running count in my head, not out of self-pity. I have never had much patience for self-pity, but out of a contractor's habit, you document the work, you keep the receipts. Every dismissal, every slight, every moment when I was managed like a liability rather than treated like a person, I kept count. I called them what they were: cuts. The first real cut came at a neighborhood cookout when my son introduced me to his neighbor as my dad. He's staying with us while he figures out his next chapter. I was standing right there. I had not lost a chapter. I had not lost anything except my wife, which is a grief no man has to justify to strangers. But the story my son needed to tell about me, the story that explained my presence in his house in a way that did not threaten his image, was the story of a man adrift, a man who needed guidance, a man who owed his current shelter to the generosity of his successful son. That story required me to be diminished, so he diminished me, one introduction at a time. Cut 2 was the gala invitation. Kayla mentioned it casually at dinner one night, saying that since I would be around anyway, I could help receive guests at the door and point them toward the coat check, not as family, as an extra set of hands. I said fine. I did not have plans, but I noted it. The gala was held on a Thursday evening in late October. The building, my building, had been decorated with the kind of expensive minimalism that costs a great deal of money to make look effortless. Black and white everywhere, recessed lighting, a catering crew in matching dark shirts setting up stations of hors d'oeuvres. I arrived early, and a young woman with a headset clipped a generic staff lanyard around my neck before I could explain who I was. I almost took it off. Instead, I kept it on and walked into the lobby. The lobby had a display case near the front entrance. It was a beautiful piece of custom millwork, dark walnut, glass panels, interior spotlights. It had been installed to showcase what the company described in its marketing materials as artifacts of American craftsmanship and ingenuity: old tools, vintage gauges, industrial objects mounted like museum pieces. Kayla had designed the whole thing. She had come to me 4 months ago and asked if I had any interesting old things she could borrow for the display. I told her I had some nice pieces. She said she would return them after the event. I stopped in front of the case and my breath left my body. On the center shelf, mounted on a small velvet stand under a focused beam of warm light, was my father's railroad pocket watch. It was an Illinois Watch Company model from 1924. My grandfather had carried it on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad for 30 years. When he retired, he passed it to my father, who kept it in a carved wooden box on his dresser until the day he died. At my father's funeral, my mother pressed that box into my hands and told me it was the most important object in the family. I had kept it in a fireproof lockbox in my room since the day I moved into my son's house. Kayla had gone into my room, into my lockbox. I had never given her the combination, which meant she had found it some other way. She had taken the single most irreplaceable thing I owned and mounted it in a glass case in a lobby full of strangers so that her husband's company would look like it had heritage and depth. I stood in front of that case for a long time. The lobby was filling up around me. Men in expensive clothes walked past. Servers wove through the crowd. My son's voice carried from the far end of the room where he was working the arrivals, laughing his polished laugh. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the display case. That was not a cut. That was something deeper. That was a violation of the only things left that still connected me to the people I had loved most in my life. I did not make a scene. I walked to the hallway near the kitchen, stood with my back against the wall, and breathed slowly until the shaking in my hands stopped. A server came by, and I took a glass of water off his tray and drank it without tasting it. Then I put the glass down, straightened my jacket, and went back to work, because the evidence was not finished arriving yet, and I needed to hear all of it. The rest of the evening delivered it in a steady, methodical stream. My son walked past me 3 times in the first hour without acknowledging my presence. Not out of malice, I think. More out of the way you stop seeing furniture. I had been successfully rendered invisible. Cut 3. A senior investor, a large man in his late 50s with the kind of handshake that means business, asked my son who I was when I walked past them with a tray. My son glanced at me with the expression of a man asked to explain something mildly embarrassing. "That's Irwin," he said. "He has been with us a long time. With us. Like a piece of equipment that had been on the company's books for years." Cut 4 happened near the bar. Kayla was holding court with 2 investors' wives, describing the office build-out, the renovation, the design choices. She touched the wall like it was hers, talked about the architecture like she had personally commissioned it. Then she said, very smooth and very certain, "Of course Jared owns the property outright, which gives us incredible stability as we scale." She said it in a room where I was the only person present who knew it was a lie. Cut 5, 6, and 7 arrived in a cluster around 9 o'clock. I was asked to go fetch a phone charger from a storage room on the third floor. While I waited for the elevator, I overheard my son in the adjacent alcove running through his investor pitch with two partners. He was describing the building's appraised value as a core company asset. He was framing it as equity his business held free and clear. He mentioned taking out a real estate-backed line of credit against the property to fund their next growth phase. His exact words were, "Real estate-backed lending is smarter than diluting equity. We have the asset. We use the asset." The asset was mine. He was planning to borrow money against a building he did not own, using financial instruments he had no legal authority to execute, to fund a company expansion. That was not a personal insult. That was fraud. It carried a federal definition and a prison sentence attached. I got the charger. I brought it back downstairs. I smiled at a woman who asked where the restrooms were and pointed her in the right direction. I helped clear a table of empty glasses, and I counted. Cut 8 was when a guest accidentally spilled his drink near my feet, and my son handed me a stack of cocktail napkins without looking at me once. Handed them to me the way you hand things to someone whose entire purpose is to solve your small problems. Cut 9. I overheard Kayla explain to a small group that the vintage watch in the lobby display had been in Jared's family for generations. A technically true statement deployed as a lie. Yes, in his family. Specifically in his grandfather's family, and then his father's family, and then in the fireproof lockbox in his father's room that someone had opened without asking. Cut 10 was the speech. Around 10 o'clock, my son clinked a glass, and the room gathered. He stood at the front of the lobby and spoke for 12 minutes. It was a good speech, I will give him that. He knew how to command a room. He talked about building something from nothing. He talked about the courage it takes to bet on yourself. He talked about his company's physical home, the building, its history, what it represented, and he described it as proof of his commitment to permanence, to stability, to putting down roots instead of renting someone else's vision. He used the word ownership 4 times. The investors nodded and sipped their drinks and believed every word. At minute 8, he gestured toward the display case. "Some of you have noticed the artifacts in the lobby," he said, smiling. "That watch belonged to a railroad worker, a man who showed up every single day and did the work no one else wanted to do. That is the spirit this company was built on." He paused for effect. "We keep it here to remind ourselves where grit actually comes from." He did not say who that railroad worker was. He did not say where the watch came from or who it actually belonged to. He used my grandfather's 30 years on the railroad as a prop in his investor pitch. He used my most private and sacred possession as marketing material, and he did it in a room full of strangers, while I stood 20 feet away with a staff lanyard around my neck. That was cut 10, the last one. I took the lanyard off. I folded it neatly and set it on the edge of the coat check table. I walked to the elevator, rode it to the 3rd floor, and went into the small office I knew was unlocked because I had fixed the latch 3 weeks earlier and never told anyone. I sat down in the dark in a chair facing the window and looked out at the Nashville skyline for a long time. I thought about the boy my son used to be. There was a year, he was maybe 9 or 10, when he went through a phase of following me on weekend jobs. He would carry my tool bag without being asked. He would hand me wire connectors and flashlight the junction box so I could see clearly. He asked questions, constantly, good questions, the kind that told you a child was actually thinking and not just making noise. I remembered a Saturday afternoon in a school gymnasium we were rewiring for the district, just the 2 of us, and he looked up at the ceiling panel I was working in and said, "Dad, how do you know how much electricity is too much?" And I told him about load calculations and circuit ratings. And then I told him the same principle applied to life, that the answer to how much is too much is that you learn to read the warning signs before everything trips. He stopped reading the warning signs somewhere after the MBA. I picked up my cell phone, not the one I used for family calls, but the second one, kept active since I sold the contracting business, the one connected to Copper Ridge Holdings and the property management account and my financial advisor. I dialed a number from memory, It rang twice. "Stuart," I said when he answered. "It is Irwin. I need you to be awake. My attorney has been practicing real estate and business law in Ohio for 26 years. He sounds more alert at 11 at night than most people do at noon on a Tuesday." He told me he was awake. He asked what was happening. I told him everything. Not emotionally. I did not have any emotion left at that point, just clarity. I told him about the gala. I told him about the investor pitch. I told him the exact words my son had used about the building, about the line of credit, about borrowing against an asset he had misrepresented as his own to a room full of people with money. And I told him about the watch. Stuart went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Irwin, what he described to those investors, that is fraud. He cannot leverage a leased property as company equity. He does not hold title. He does not hold a deed. He holds a commercial lease with a 60-day termination clause. If he approaches a lender with that representation, he is exposed criminally." "I know," I said. "You want me to flag it to the regulators?" "Not yet. I want to handle the building first." Another pause. "You are going to invoke the termination clause." "I am going to invoke the termination clause, and I am going to call in the note." This was the second piece that my son had apparently forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood. 4 years ago, when his company was 9 months old and running out of runway, he came to me asking for money. He needed $300,000 to make payroll through the next funding round. I gave it to him, not as a gift, because I was not willing to let him treat money as something that fell out of the sky, but as a formal promissory note with a repayment schedule and a demand clause. The demand clause stated that I could call the entire principal due with 30 days written notice at any time, and for any reason. He had signed it. His attorney at the time had reviewed every word. It was a legal, binding document, and my son had not made a single scheduled payment in 14 months. "If I call the note and terminate the lease simultaneously," I said to Stuart, "what is the realistic timeline?" 30 days on the note, 60 on the lease. But given he is in default on the note, I can argue material breach and accelerate the whole thing. I can have certified letters drafted and served by Monday morning. He has a board meeting with the investors Monday afternoon. Stuart understood immediately. I will have them there by 10. I told him one more thing. I told him about an offer I had received 6 weeks earlier from a commercial real estate firm that managed properties for several Nashville businesses, including one that happened to be my son's largest regional competitor. They had offered to purchase the building at full appraised value, nearly $2.4 million, with a 60-day close. I had turned it down at the time because I had not yet decided what I wanted to do with the property. I had made that decision now. "Call them Sunday morning," I said. "Tell them the property is available, and I want a 45-day close." "Done." Stuart paused. "Irwin, this is going to end his company." "His company was already ending," I said. "He was borrowing against a building he does not own to cover losses he had not disclosed to his investors. I did not build this situation. I am just the one who has to clean it up." He was quiet for a moment longer. "Do you want me to draft any provisions? Any carve-outs that give him an exit ramp? Some way to make the note current, renegotiate the lease?" I looked out at the city. The lights were steady and indifferent. I thought about Lorene, who had loved our son unconditionally, and who had worried in her last weeks about what he was becoming, and whether we had done enough to give him a compass. I thought about the watch downstairs in the glass case. My grandfather's 60-year career on the railroad reduced to lobby decoration. My father's inheritance used as a prop, so strangers would feel impressed. "No carve-outs," I said. "Let it run." I hung up and sat in the dark until the sounds of the gala below me faded and the building went quiet. My son left the next morning for a 3-day conference in Atlanta. Kayla went with him. They told me to keep the house in order while they were gone, and left a list on the kitchen counter. Gutters needed checking. The back door handle was loose. The grill burners needed cleaning. A list. For me. They drove away before 8. By 10 that morning, Stuart had reached the buyer's representative by phone. By noon, the preliminary purchase agreement was drafted. By 4 in the afternoon, the certified letters were prepared. 2 of them, one notifying my son of the demand on the promissory note, one providing formal notice of lease termination per the 60-day clause, and a process server had been engaged to deliver both to the registered office address of the company on Monday morning. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what the note on the kitchen counter had asked. I cleaned the gutters. I tightened the back door handle. I cleaned the grill burners, not because they had told me to, but because I have never been the kind of man who leaves a job undone. When you walk away from something, you walk away with your work completed, and your tools put back where they belong. On Monday, my son's board meeting fell apart before it started. The certified letters arrived at 9:58. By the time the investors assembled at 2, the lead partner, a man named Graham, who I later learned had spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor before moving into private equity, had already spoken to his own attorney about the building's actual ownership. By 3, the meeting had been converted into something much less pleasant than a growth strategy session. My son called my cell phone at 3:47. He called the old number, the family one. He called it 11 times between 3:47 and 5 o'clock. I watched the screen light up and go dark, light up and go dark, from the kitchen table where I was drinking coffee and reading the paper. On the 12th call, I answered. He was not the smooth man from the gala. He was not the polished executive who practiced his smile in mirrors. His voice was unraveling at the seams, and somewhere underneath the panic and the anger and the demands for an explanation, I could hear something that sounded almost like the 9-year-old boy who used to hand me wire connectors in dark ceiling panels and ask me how I knew when something was too much. I let him talk until he ran out of words. It took a while. When the silence finally came, I spoke quietly and without anger, because anger was not what I felt. What I felt was something older and more settled than anger. I told him that the building had been mine since before he signed the lease. I told him about Copper Ridge Holdings and what it was. I told him that the promissory note was in default, and the demand was legal and binding. I told him the building had been sold to new owners, and that the lease termination gave him 60 days to vacate. I told him that Graham and the other investors had been informed of the discrepancy between what my son had represented about his assets and what the public record actually showed. Then I told him about the watch. I told him I had gone into the lobby after the gala and taken it back from the display case. I told him it was in my jacket pocket right now. I told him it was going home with me to Ohio, back into the carved wooden box on my workbench shelf where it was going to stay. He asked me why. He asked me how I could do this to him. He used the word family several times in ways that suggested he had only recently discovered its meaning. I told him that family was exactly the reason. That family was the only thing that had made me patient as long as I had been patient. That family was what that watch meant, and what the contracting business meant, and what 33 years of 5 in the morning starts meant, and that a man who treats his family like a maintenance crew and his father like a charity case has already made his choice about what matters to him. I told him I loved him. I told him that love and consequence were not opposites. I told him I hoped he would call me when he was ready to have a real conversation. I meant it. Then I told him the last thing quietly, only once. The building his company had been operating in, the one he had described to investors as their anchor asset, the one he had called proof of his commitment to permanence, had been sold to the tenant moving in at the end of the 60-day period. The tenant was his largest regional competitor. They were going to be paying rent to Copper Ridge Holdings every month. The name was going to look very familiar on their statements. I heard him stop breathing. Then I heard the line go quiet in the particular way that tells you a person has nothing left. I said goodbye and hung up. Kayla filed for legal separation 5 weeks later. The investor group declined to proceed with the funding round, after due diligence confirmed the asset misrepresentation. The company was dissolved by court order the following spring when the promissory note judgment came through. I did not pursue that outcome aggressively. Stewart told me it was simply the trajectory once the defaults and misrepresentations became part of the court record. I did not return to Nashville. I drove back to Ohio in my truck, the same one I had driven for 11 years, the one that still had a roll of electrical tape in the center console and a spare pair of work gloves on the back seat. I bought a small house on a lake outside Granville. It has a workshop out back with good lighting and a decent bench vise, and enough room to spread out a project properly. In the evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the light change on the water. The railroad watch is on the shelf in the workshop, back in its carved wooden box, right where it belongs. I do not tell this story because I am proud of it. I tell it because I spent 33 years in a trade that required me to understand one fundamental principle. Hidden things have power. The wiring in the walls, the load in the circuit, the current running silently through a building while everyone inside goes about their business without knowing or caring what is underneath. All of it has weight, and all of it will eventually make itself known. My son built his life on the assumption that the things he could not see had no power over him. He was wrong about that. He was wrong the way a man is wrong, who ignores every warning sign until the whole circuit trips at once. I hope he finds his way through it. I hope someday he remembers that Saturday afternoon in the gymnasium, and the question he asked me about how much was too much. The answer has not changed. You read the load. You respect the limits. You do not borrow against something that is not yours and call it an asset. The lake is quiet in the mornings. I have started sleeping well again for the first time in years. Some things take a long time to earn their silence, but when they finally arrive, they are worth every minute of the wait.